Well, Thursday and Friday will be the last days of the Supreme Court's term before taking the summer off. Although I got to say, folks, they could also extend in the next week. It's up to them. The two big issues that are left, though, are a decision that would affect the future of affirmative action in higher education, and another about the legality of President Biden forgiving more than $400 billion in student loan debt.
And back with us to discuss all this and more, criminal defense attorney Randy Zellin, plus trial attorney Rachel Kugel. Thank you guys for being back with us. I'll start off with you, Rachel. What do you make of the fact that they didn't decide on those two huge cases, the affirmative action, the student loan debt? I mean, those are the two cases we were waiting to see. Instead, they just kind of ruled on the whole redistricting, which is an important decision, don't get me wrong, but... And
made a lot of news today, and we've all been talking about it. And it is something that historically the Supreme Court likes to do, right? They like to drip these out in ways that create a lot of drama around their decisions. And so I think that you're seeing some of that here, you know, giving us stuff to talk about all week with excitement.
So let's talk about it, though. As far as the student loan debt, Randy, we were talking at a break, a good point you make. The president kind of unilaterally, said, you don't have to pay the loan back. We're in an emergency. This is pandemic era. But now it's like, hey, hold on again. I have kids, two of them in college. Why should somebody else get their loans forgiven because a guy scored political points for it?
And why do people, like people that already paid their loans? And what about my mortgage? Can I get that forgiven too?
Well, that's the argument. That's why when you talk about standing, which is a fancy way of saying, if I take your phone, you've been injured, you have standing to sue me. Now, if I take your phone, does Bob have standing to sue me? He hasn't been injured. So the question here is, okay,
it's a moral question.
You've got two people who, hey, I don't qualify. Do they have standing?
Right.
Then you have states attorneys general. Do they have standing? But the real issue is, does the executive branch have the ability in an emergency to take the power that is normally given to the legislature, and now that that emergency is over, can you still get rid of it? And, of course, the question of cancel versus waive versus modify. The HEROES Act doesn't say cancel. It says waive or modify. So the textualists would say, well, if we wanted it to say cancel, word cancel would be in there.
Okay.
Right.
Let's talk affirmative action. This is going to be a huge decision.
A big one.
The contention is that one of the contentions is we've been allowing race considerations long enough. There's a time for that to phase out. There are others saying, but there's racism still going on. You have Asians that are not getting into Harvard and Duke and other places because they're Asian or they're not another minority.
It's a question of whether race has any place in the process, whether skin color is something that can have a place for better or for worse, you know, in either way. And I think you kind of can't have it both ways at a certain point, right? If it can be used, then it can be used. If it can't, then it can't. And don't forget that there's already 9 states that don't allow the use of race.
But the colleges that do say it's just a component. It's just part of the analogy of whether the student should be.
It's supposed to be this holistic approach.
Right.
Look, I have never been subjected to discrimination or racism, so it's hard for me to
Although that holistic approach was put in by Harvard decades ago because Jewish people were discriminated against.
I mean, to me, what's really fascinating that isn't talked very much about is the fact that you have Justice Thomas, who is African-American, who is really reticent to talk about his experience at Yale Law School. And it's his clerks, apparently, that are going to be arguing against it. His former clerks are arguing, I think, the side of no more of this. But again, it's weird for me to say, do we get rid of it, do we not? Because I've never been subjected
But I think it also hurts people of color, too, that supposedly benefit from this, because then they'll say, oh, well, so-and-so got into that school because he's this or she's that. And meanwhile, they could be extremely qualified.
And I think that's what Justice Thomas talked about.
It has a presumption, a starting point that you're lesser.
Wouldn't you want to be in on merit? And I think Justice Thomas has touched upon that. I wonder, did I get into Yale because of the color of my skin, or did I get into Yale on merit?
Now, they're saying, but is it a part of your experience? The fact that you grow up poor and African-American somewhere, or the fact that you grow up Asian and you're first generation in the United States? Is that a component, part of the holistic approach? How do you account for race without accounting for race in and of itself?
So I think that it still leaves room for people to, write essays that detail their personal experience that might be about race,
or
ethnicity, religion. That's different. I think the checkbox is very different than writing an essay or submitting some dossier that shows your full experience. I think that's holistic. I think checking a box, not
But
so
if you get a $15.99 on the SATs and you don't get in because you're white.
Which is one of the people attached to this is an Asian person who did that.
And then I think also what we were saying too, I think it also depends on your socioeconomic class, right? And all the adversities that you may have overcome or not overcome. Because you could be an African American person with all the advantages of anybody in the world, and a white person may the opposite.
And that's the totality of the circumstances approach, and that's appropriate.
And skin color doesn't take into account. You can be African American and your father was a doctor and you live in a wealthy neighborhood. And, so just because someone's skin color is one way or another, what does that say about them? And I think that's the question we should be asking.
And then the Grutter, the case that said long enough. O'Connell saying, 25 years.
They're wrapping us. They're wrapping us. They're saying, zip it up. Randy Zellin, Rachel Kugel, thank you guys for joining us. Love talking to you. Coming up.